I just want to bring in another guest that will hopefully bring us up to date on everything. I want to bring in now Wesley Wark. He's in Ottawa. He's a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. He served on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on National Security from 2005 to 2009 and joins us now. Mr. Wark, I'm so happy to have you on to help break this all down for us. You have learned, I have learned, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau told his caucus, premiers, he's invoking the Emergencies Act. What do you think of this?
I think it's long overdue, to be honest. Canadians will be surprised, some will be shocked, because they've never heard of the Emergencies Act. And no wonder. It's an old piece of legislation that dates back to 1988, has never been used, has never been updated, has never been discussed in public. But there has been so much jurisdictional buck passing with regard to this protest back and forth between the federal government, the Ontario provincial government, the city authorities in Ottawa, that I think we've come to a pass where the federal government realizes it's had to take the lead on this and assume responsibility for dealing with the protest. And that's why I think finally Justin Trudeau has decided to invoke the Emergencies Act. Now, there are specific provisions in the Emergencies Act that I think will be helpful to dealing with this protest. There are very clear powers provided in the Emergencies Act. And the federal government, if any government in Canada has the resources to bring this protest to an end. That is a policing response, but I also expect that we will see, although the Trudeau government is going very cautiously on this, we will see a call for the military to aid the civil authorities in bringing this protest to an end. That's not to say we'll see soldiers with guns in the front lines confronting protesters. I don't think any of us imagines that will happen or wants it to happen. But the military support in terms of tactics, heavy equipment, intelligence support, surveillance, and so on is going to be so important, because one of the things that has been clear in terms of the handling of this protest from the beginning is that there have been terrible intelligence failures about the nature of this protest.
Yeah, explain that a little bit, because David and I were talking about this earlier. I had interviewed a fella that he came here, he thought he'd drive around for a couple of days, but was directed downtown and parked right in front of the Parliament buildings and is now camping there indefinitely.
Yeah, it's extraordinary that, as David Cochrane and others have commented, extraordinary that the city kind of opened its arms and welcomed the trucks and the protest movement to downtown on the basis of some assumption about the peacefulness and temporary nature of this protest, which was clearly unwarranted. The Ottawa authorities, as well as federal and provincial, had 2 weeks' notice that this protest convoy was heading to Ottawa, and no reason to assume that it would necessarily be a very temporary or peaceful or lawful protest, and it hasn't been any of those things.
When you talk about the provisions of the Emergencies Act that can be specifically used, can you tell us specifically about those provisions you're talking about?
Sure. So, Hannah, it's laid out in what's called Part 2 of the Emergencies Act. This is a public emergency, as it's defined, public order emergency, and there's very specific provisions laid out there. And it's also important, I think, to explain to your listeners that the Emergencies Act does not override other laws in Canada. It certainly does not override charter provisions. So it is meant to be embedded in, Canada's usual democratic constitutional practice, but it gives the federal government extra authority. I think the most important power it gives the federal government is the ability to define a place, a zone that has to be secured, and to prevent people from coming into or out of that zone until it's cleared. Now, it also gives the federal government the responsibility for levying fines and deciding on imprisonment terms. But the clear thing is really securing a protected place, as it's described in the public order emergency portion of the Emergencies Act. And I think this will be applied to the downtown Ottawa core, because the protesters are camped outside the Prime Minister's office, outside key federal government departments and agencies, including some of our central intelligence offices in downtown Ottawa, camped outside, obviously, the Parliament. And this has to end, quite apart from all the inconvenience and distress it's caused to downtown Ottawa citizens.
We heard from Leah West a little bit earlier. She says this really is just a failure to enforce and that the Emergencies Act wasn't needed. What do you think of that comment?
I disagree with Leah. I mean, Leah and I have exchanged views on this as I prepared a piece calling for the Emergency Act, which was published on Friday. You know, I think it does require a policing response, clearly, but it also requires a jurisdiction to be in clear charge of the situation. And that jurisdiction now is going to be the federal government, which is, I think, appropriate because, you know, this crisis has called into question Canadians' trust in government and in the federal government in particular. And this is precisely what the protesters want to see happen, which is why I believe this protest is deeply anti-democratic. And so Canadians, I think, want to see their trust in government and the ability of government to protect them and secure them and fulfill its national security duties enacted. And there was no way that this was going to happen, as we've seen over the last 18 days, unless the federal government finally stepped in. And as I said, I think it's high time that they did so.
Let me ask you this. Everybody's sitting at home, in particular people in Ottawa, residents who are extremely tired of what they have seen take over their city for the past 3 weeks. What can they expect to see now that the Emergencies Act has been invoked?
Well, I think what they can expect to see is a flood of beginning of serious enforcement of fines and ticketing and the end to the free movement, frankly, and this is the most important thing, the end to the free movement of protesters in Ottawa. I mean, you see trucks and cars traveling around in Ottawa, flying their so-called patriotic flags without hindrance. This is going to end. The protesters are going to be put under siege and they're going to be isolated, and this will be a first step to clearing them out. And I think at the end of the day, the government will go slowly on this because they need parliamentary approval within 7 days. But in the end, I think the federal government is going to have to call in the military to help the civil authorities end this protest.
How quickly do you think we will start to see the movement of protesters out of the downtown of Ottawa?
I would hope today. I would hope today that we begin to see this enforcement. When the Emergencies Act is invoked, it takes place immediately, and there's no point in invoking it unless you follow it with action, because that will only further lower Canadians' trust in government and the ability of the federal government to deal with this. So I'm sure that Justin Trudeau and his cabinet have considered the timing of this and the need to follow the invocation of the Emergencies Act with real action.
And then would you say, and I think David was saying a bit earlier, that we would expect to hear from the Prime Minister on this, that the Prime Minister come out and explain exactly, why he implemented it and how we'll see things move forward?
Yes, obviously he's had that conversation with the provincial premiers and territorial leaders. And by the way, I would add, the Emergencies Act does not require all provincial leaders and territorial leaders to agree to its imposition. It only requires the approval of the government, provincial government most directly affected, which is in this case the Ontario government, at least for now. So we don't need a national consensus on this. We only need one province stepping up, and it seems that Doug Ford is prepared to do that. But yes, the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers will have to step forward and explain to Canadians, partly because Canadians have never heard of the Emergencies Act, understandably. Mm-hmm. So they'll want to know, and they'll want to be reassured about how it's going to be invoked. So we need those details, and we need to hear them from the Prime Minister.
Let me just ask you, we were hearing earlier in the Premier's meeting that Saskatchewan and Alberta were saying that by invoking this, they felt that this would simply embolden the protesters. What do you think of that type of comment?
I fundamentally disagree. I think not invoking the Emergencies Act is exactly what is emboldening the protesters. Provincial premiers in the West, for their own political reasons, in terms of their own political bases, may not like this, and they may not be part of it. I mean, that's a decision for them to make and to take the political costs, whatever they might be, in terms of their own political futures. What is required in this case is the agreement of the Ontario provincial government. And from all that we've heard from Doug Ford in this, I find it hard to imagine that he will disagree with the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And I also expect that Parliament will sign onto it within that 7-day window that's required by the Act.
It did appear from a press conference earlier, Premier Doug Ford didn't seem to disagree with using the Emergencies Act a bit earlier. So just before you go, I just want to ask you one thing on the military. Why is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, making sure to be careful? You're saying they'll likely use it, but being so careful to say, well, that's not where we're going in this.
It could be a matter of temperament. It's hard to kind of peer into the cabinet meeting discussions on this. Of course, we don't really have access to that. Could be temperament. It could be a sense that his caucus is a bit divided on that question itself. We don't know that exactly, but we've heard comments from Joel Lightbound, for example, which would suggest there's some division in the Liberal ranks itself. And I think the Liberal government wants to go a bit slowly on calling on aid to the military power, because it does need that parliamentary approval of the Emergencies Act. It does need the Ontario government on side. And incidentally, aid to the civil power, that is calling in the military, requires an act by the Ontario provincial government. The call actually has to come from the Attorney General of the province of Ontario, and then the federal government acts on it. So there is that complicated dance, I think, that's probably going on between, in all kinds of fora within the Liberal caucus, in the mind of the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers, between the Prime Minister and Doug Ford's government.
Looking forward a week from now, how will we be looking back on this?
I think we'll be looking back on this as a terrible failure of governance, to be honest. And I think that we'll have to reflect very deeply on why that failure of governance occurred, including an intelligence failure, as I've suggested. And I think the way forward, frankly, is the calling of a federal commission of inquiry to examine all aspects of this crisis, because we never want to see anything like this again in the kind of body politic of Canadian democracy.
Okay, Wesley Wark, thank you for breaking it all down. Always appreciate your time and your insight. Wesley Wark, a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Hannah.